Hi, I'm Darryn Farrugia and welcome. In today's video, I want to throw the focus on the strainer, that all-important lever on your snare drum. So let's get into it. In the last 10 or 15 years, there have been some really amazing advancements in the development of the snare drum strainer. Lots of drum companies and also independent companies have been making some really nice and very easy to use and very easy to adjust snare drum strainers. And so with all of this technology available to us, they still basically perform two primary functions. One of them is to engage and disengage the snare wires. And the other function is to determine how tight or how loose those snare wires are. And that's where the focus of this video is going to be. So the other night I had a young student, ask me how to adjust the wires on the snare drum, and I kind of went on a bit of a rave, so I'm going to share this with you today. So the answer to that question is really determined by the style of music you're playing, the kind of sound that you want, and also how much articulation you want from the strokes that you are playing. Anyway, before we get into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the snare drum that I'm using today and how I've got it set up and how I've got it tuned. This snare drum is a 6.5-inch Yamaha brass shell snare drum. I'm not even sure of the exact model number of it, but it's one that I've had for about 30 years. I really like the sound of it, and I use it a lot, particularly low tuning. So this snare drum is tuned pretty low. So let me just take this zero ring off it so that you can hear how low it is. I'm also going to turn the wires off. So it's pretty low, and I have one of these Remo zero rings on top of that just to kill some of those nasty overtones that you get from the edge of the drum. And this leads me to the next part of this, how tight these wires are. So I've got the wires on this drum pretty tight at the moment, and the reason is just to demonstrate that if I play a lot of fast strokes, even on a drum that's tuned pretty low, I can still get a bunch of articulation and detail from the notes that I'm playing. So I'll switch these wires on. Now if I play fast double strokes, for example, we're getting all of that detail from all of those fast notes. It's not sounding obscure or inarticulate. So that's when I would choose to have the wires pretty tight. For most of the work that I do, I would have them pretty tight because, well, sometimes I play fast notes. Let's hear the same thing now. I'm going to back those wires off. I'm going to loosen them off a little bit and try to play the same thing, and you'll hear what I mean. You can hear the notes, but they're just not as tight, not as crisp. But that's still on a loosely tuned drum. If I was playing a tighter snare drum, the same rules would apply. I would still have the wires pretty tight so that I can hear all of those faster strokes. Now another thing I should say with this video is I'm actually using a microphone on the bottom of the snare drum as well. So I've got the trusty SM57 on the top, and then the bottom mic is just a cheap microphone that I like to use occasionally on the bottom. In terms of EQ, I usually roll off all the bottom end, and I may boost a little bit of top end just depending on how much brightness I want from those bottom wires. So moving on from the tight wires, what I'm going to do now is start backing them off, and I would usually use this if I'm trying to get a little bit more length from the snare drum itself. So it's almost like dialing in a reverb or dialing in the length button, let's say, on a snare drum. So I'm just trying to make that snare drum sustain a little longer. So this is where the snare wires were in terms of tightness, pretty tight. I'm going to back this off a little bit now. I'm trying to get a little bit more length in the sustain of that snare drum. It's a little longer. I'm going to go much longer. So the snare wires are a little looser now, which gives me a little bit more length, a little bit more sustain. I'm going to play a groove. I'm going to see if you can hear the difference. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Going to go looser again. 1, 2, 3, 4. And even further. I'm going to try going a little looser again. Another sonic thing I like to do is throw a tortilla, not an actual tortilla that you would eat, but a drumming tortilla on the snare drum. So I'm going to do that for you. Now adding the tortilla will actually drop the pitch of the snare drum a little further as well. So hopefully at this point we've got a nice fat sounding snare drum with a lot of sustain courtesy of those loose wires on the bottom. One, two, three. Just for the hell of it, I'm going to loosen these wires even more. Okay, this is going to be quite ridiculous, but you'll hear them rattling on the bottom. Again, it could be used as an effect. I've done this on recordings in the past. Now, I'm not going to play rim shots this time. I'm going to actually just hit the snare drum in the middle using the butt end of the stick just so I can get a slightly fatter attack. Let's check this out. This is just an experiment. 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you're doing things like recordings, if you're recording at home, if you're recording for clients, if you're recording sessions and all that sort of stuff, these are a few really neat tricks to have if you get that opportunity to mess around with the snare drum sounds. I've done this on a few records in the last few years, and it's just so much fun to be able to experiment with this type of thing. A few other things to think about, if you're using a bottom snare drum mic, reverse the phase of the bottom snare drum mic just to ensure that the snare drum stays nice and fat and remains in phase. And if you don't have a tortilla, you can always use, tea towels and that sort of thing if you're trying to go for that really low fat 70s dead snare drum sound. So I recommend that you experiment with different tunings, different size drums, different heads, etc. I opted for this video to go for a low tuned snare drum so that you could hear the influence that the wires have. For example, when the wires are tight on the bottom, you still get all of that articulation when you're playing fast notes, 30-second notes, etc. But then again, if you want to get that big fat snare drum sound, backing off the tension on those wires and allowing for more sustain on the drum really works well with low tuned snare drums. But it's really up to you. Have a lot of fun. It's all about sound and how that snare drum fits in the mix of a tune. Anyway, that's all I've got for you this week. If you enjoyed the video, give it the thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, subscribe and remember to hit that notification bell so that you know when I've uploaded a video, which is every week. So until next week, have a great week and see you all soon. Bye.